Marc Antony had everything in his favor to become the first Roman emperor. He was highly regarded by Julius Caesar, considered by many his direct successor after Caesar's sudden assassination. Very accomplished general, an energetic politician, highly charismatic, he had everything to rally the army and the people to his side and sweep away any opposition to his dream of uncontested power. None of that happened, however. We could say that a part of that was for Antony's own set of character flaws, but it was mainly because Antony had to contend with no one less than Octavian, Caesar's nephew, posthumously adopted son, a cunning political genius that eventually became the first emperor, as we know, Augustus. But Antony too tried to win people's hearts, and he used coins extensively with this objective. So how about we take a look at some coins issued by Marc Antony, and what kinds of message did he try to pass with them? Let's go. Now, before jumping into Antony's coins, we're taking a step back and taking a look into the overall historical context Antony was in. It's the 1st century BC, and the Roman Republican system is in full crisis. The de facto authority held by the Senate is quickly being overshadowed by that of the so-called imperatores. These imperatores, these men, were also politicians, members of the Senate, but their true power came from the huge number of troops under their own command. Their own political ambition, backed up by so many troops, led them to, well, bend the rules a bit and do whatever they wanted, with little consideration to the decisions of the Senate they were supposed to be subordinates of. Now, don't mix up this name with the modern word emperor. Imperator comes from the verb imperare, meaning to command, and it was mostly connected to a military position, to the command of troops and the power of life and death. Some of the most famous characters of Roman history were amongst these imperatores. Think about Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, or Lucius Cornelius Sulla. One of the most flagrant transgressions against the republican system these imperatores engaged in was the issue of their own money to pay for their personal allegiance and to buy political favor. Previously, the issue of coinage was tightly controlled by the Senate, with occasional permission being given to generals on campaign or in special situations like to pay for wars. Julius Caesar himself issued numerous types of coins under his own authority, with the most famous example being the silver denarii featuring his own portrait, the first living Roman to dare do such a thing. After Caesar's assassination, showing your own portrait on coins became a common practice amongst these strongmen. Here's where our friend Marc Antony comes in. Being one of Caesar's closest allies and one of his generals, he quickly started issuing coins featuring his own portrait, showing himself in mourning for Caesar's death and as an avenger of his fallen friend. We have on screen now an example of one of these first coins issued under him. Notice he has let a beard grow on his face, something Romans would only do when a close friend or relative died, and he has a veil over his head. As a pontifex, a priest, a position Caesar held once, he's seen here as a pious man, a religious man, carrying on the legacy of his colleague. So Marc Antony, Octavian, and a fellow general, Lepidus, established a formal alliance we call today the Second Triumvirate. The three men shared absolute power over Rome for an initial term of 5 years, between 43 and 37 BC, and set off on a military campaign against the assassins of Caesar. This major civil war required numerous coins to be struck, and this leads us to the first coin of the day. A denarius struck at around 43 BC in a moving military mint with Antony's troops as he marched into Greece to meet Caesar's assassins. The obverse is a clear show of strength on Antony's part, a bold portrait of the man with this very serious and determined expression, the exact kind of firmness and strength people wanted to see from a general coming to win a war quickly and decisively. He knew people considered him the senior member of this triumvirate, and he meant to show it. On the legends, a very simple message: Marcus Antonius Imperator, Marc Antony, commander. On the reverse we have the facing radiant bust of Sol, the sun god, within a temple. Antony knew very well his soldiers. Sun-worshipping cults were always quite popular in the army, so picking this deity for a coin used to pay soldiers is quite a smart move. The legends are straight to the point. Triumvir res publicae constituendae. Triumvir for the restoration of the Republic. As you can see, the entire visual composition of this coin was meant to boost the morale of the troops, a very smart example of focused propaganda for a specific niche in mind, his own soldiers. With their enemies defeated and with tensions brewing between Antony and Octavian, people feared that a new civil war would erupt as soon as the last one ended. To ensure that peace was to be maintained between the triumvirs, Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia. The couple went east, to the territories Antony was responsible of, and a series of coins commemorating the wedding were issued at the city of Ephesus in 39 BC. This impressive silver coin is a Christophorus, a type of tetradrachma issued at the region for centuries before the Romans conquered it. The Romans saw it had very good acceptance in the region of Ephesus, so they just let the local cities keep issuing them, but enforced their own iconography on the coinage. On the obverse we have the Jugate bust, Jugate means side by side, bust of Antony and Octavia. Something I find interesting about the bust of Octavia here is that she looks a whole lot like Octavian. I mean, she was his sister, she was supposed to look at least similar to him, but it's almost like the die engraver of the type did not know exactly how she looked like, so he just engraved a bust that looked a lot like Octavian and gave him some feminine hairstyle, and boom, there it is, Octavia. Around them, the legends read Antony's official titles: Marcus Antonius Imperator, Consul designatio iterum et tertius. How curious, here he's designated consul for the second time and the third time, so he was guaranteed two consulships back to back. That's a clear sign of how power was heavily concentrated on the triumvirate, and the Senate itself was really taking a backseat on decision making. Heading to the reverse, we have a very typical design for this kind of coin, the Kista Mystica, a basket that contained two snakes, which we can see on the design as well. These were used in ceremonies dedicated to the god Dionysus, very popular in the city of Ephesus. Antony was acclaimed in the city as the new Dionysus, in fact. And here's an interesting show of a culture shock between Romans and Greeks. We seem to think of Roman religion and culture as being heavily influenced by the Greeks, and I mean, it was, but for a Roman, being a public figure and having yourself connected to the god of wine and partying, such as Dionysus, or Bacchus as the Romans called it, was actually quite bad. The whole idea of the bacchanale, the parties/orgies associated with the god, were considered a clear show of the degeneracy and effeminate nature of the Greeks that the Romans despised so much. In fact, Octavian would later use this as a propaganda move against Antony. I mean, a true Roman of good potential that was seduced by the indulgent ways of the East, neglecting his obligations to Rome. In fact, this is where we get much of Antony's image today, of this exaggerated man, this brute, fond of drinking and debauchery. But if we look at this visual message here with the eyes of someone from Ephesus, in the eyes of a native Greek that used these coins every day, there was no such negative view of Dionysus in the city. He was a god that enjoyed the good things in life, and by calling Antony the new Dionysus, the people from Ephesus merely wanted to say that he was a man that came to bring happy, prosperous times to the city. A very different message. But we all know that Antony was indeed seduced by a girl from the East. And we're talking about our girl Cleopatra here. Look at this tetradrachma, generally attributed to the year 36 BC from the city of Antioch. Antony made major concessions of territories to Cleopatra, letting her effectively control zones that were nominally Roman territory. This enraged Octavian and Rome's elite as a whole. How dare Antony give away hard-fought Roman territory to this Greek queen? And not only any queen, the Queen of Egypt, a decadent Hellenistic kingdom that was basically a Roman puppet state by that time. If we look at the legends in this coin, it really seems like Octavian's complaints made sense, actually. This is typically considered a Syrian coin, so far away from the native territories of Egypt where Cleopatra was supposed to rule. Yet, She is called Basilissa, Queen. Antony and Cleopatra are shown as equals in this coin, and this kind of public display between the two lovers definitely helped on the eventual breakdown of relations between the triumvirs. But let's go back in time to 38 BC, while Octavian and Antony were still in somewhat good terms. Here we have a denarius struck at Athens, one of Antony's bases on his eastern territories. On the obverse we have a full-body image of Antony, wearing the priestly robes of the augur and holding religious instruments. Major change in tone in the message of this coin. Antony depicts himself as a man that follows strictly the Roman traditions and his obligations as a priest to that religion. The legends reinforce this message by making reference to Antony's forefathers. We can read Marcus Antonius, Marci Filius, Marcus Nepos, so Marc Antony, son of Mark, grandson of Mark, so referencing both his father and grandfather, both called Marcus as well. Augur, Imperator, so priest and commander of troops. On the reverse we have once more the image of the sun god, probably once more a nudge to his troops. The image of Saul was also connected to the whole idea of the eastern lands, and since he was responsible for the easternmost regions of Rome's dominion, this could be seen as a message that Antony was constantly worried about the eastern affairs, that he was truly focused on the tasks the Republic had given him. The legends for the reverse once more proclaim his titles. Triumvir res publica constituendae, consul designatium iterum et tertium. In 33 BC, the second term of the triumvirate was over, and war between Antony and Octavian was inevitable. Octavian claimed that Antony had become a caricature of a leader, a would-be king in Hellenistic fashion, relinquishing his obligations to the Roman state. Antony, on the other hand, claimed Octavian had become everything the Senate feared about Julius Caesar, that he was the true tyrant, an authoritarian leader, a would-be king that bent the Senate to his will, expelling any pro-Antonian senators who opposed him. This denarius we have here was minted in Athens as Antony mobilized his massive army of some 100,000 men in Greece to head west to make war. We have the return of the authoritarian imagery on this piece. On the obverse we once more have the stern bust of Antony, and the legends once more feature the title Imperator, showing Antony was once more going to war. It reads, Antonius Augur, Imperator tertium, consul designatio tertium, tresviri res publica constituendae. And on the reverse we have nothing but some very simple legends. Antonius Augur Imperator tertium. The coins issued during the wars between Octavian and Antony look somewhat simpler, but it makes sense. After all, they had to mint enormous numbers of these coins to pay for soldiers, and there wasn't a whole lot of time to add intricacies to the dice, they just wanted coins. Finally, we go to the year 31 BC, the famous year of the Battle of Actium and the final downfall of Antony and Cleopatra. This year, Antony issued his most famous coin, the so-called Legionary Denarius. Antony had all of his troops raised, he had to issue absurd numbers of coins to pay for this massive army. And to be able to afford such an enormous issue of coins, he actually reduced the purity of the silver and the weight of these denarii slightly in comparison to the standard of the time. This led to these coins staying in circulation for centuries. Lots of them can still be found today, although generally they're quite worn from years of circulation. Let's take a look at one of these examples. On the obverse of these coins we find a war galley. This was a long ship with multiple layers of rows. At the prow, at the right side of the design, we see a kind of beak in front of the ship. This was a bronze tip, almost like a battering ram, and it was the main weapon of these warships. They would crash into the sides of enemy ships and try to sink them this way. The ships also had a contingent of marines in heavy armor that could be used to board and capture enemy vessels. Around the ship, we once more have Antony advertising his position as triumvir and restorer of the Republic. It reads once more, Antonius Augur, triumvir res publica constituendae. What makes these coins really interesting, however, it's the reverse. If that was ever meant to be a morale boost for Antony's troops, or something meant to make logistics and the distribution of these coins amongst the troops easier, we do not know. But each coin has in its reverse legends mentioning different legions from Antony's army. Between the standards, you can see a series of different legends like Legio 1, Legio 2, etc. In this particular case, we have a slight variation of the type. It actually calls the legion by its name. We read Legio 17 Classicae. After the war, the survivors of this legion were stationed in the Germanic frontier, and this would be one of the 3 legions wiped out in the disaster of the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD. However, it's highly unlikely any soldiers from Antony's time would be serving when that happened. That was 40 years after the Battle of Actium. Any survivors would have been retired by that time, but it's an interesting, cool fact about this particular coin. And just like that, Antony and his lover Cleopatra met their tragic end. Antony tried, but ultimately failed to become the first emperor of Rome. This privilege would go to Octavian, or, as we should call him, Emperor Augustus. Have you got a coin of Marc Antony? Let us know in the comment section down below. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Leave a like and consider subscribing if you did. Happy collecting, and I'll see you soon.